Now I'll talk to you later, my dear. Hello and welcome to today's episode of How to Be a Great GM. We're talking about the setting of horror. Horror is quite a tricky setting when you look at it a little bit more in depth than perhaps you normally would. What's the difference between a horror and, say, a thriller? What's the difference between a thriller and a scary scenario? Is there a difference? Well, quite honestly, there is a world of difference. And principally, when we look at horror, we answer that question by looking at the expectations that people have of exactly what is horror. Now, when you think of horror, you should think of a horrific situation. That's where the name comes from, after all. So a horrific situation is generally a situation that has some kind of gore or some kind of disgusting, visually repulsive, horrific environment. Whereas a thriller doesn't necessarily have to have any element of the horrific whatsoever. It's merely tension. So a horror then is mainly centered around the idea of a horrific environment, something that is covered in blood, something that is the internal organs of a creature, something that has died long ago, it's some kind of ghost that's crawling through the walls that are weeping blood. Whatever the case might be, a horrific situation is usually expected in a horror. If you don't have a horrific situation, you might have a scary situation, but it's not a horror situation. And I think a lot of GMs aim for the scare, or they aim for the thriller, the chase, the anticipation of an attack, and they forget the element of horror, which is at the core of what the horror settings is all about. We also generally, with some kind of horror, have some kind of unknown evil. I beg your pardon, that was the Chinese from just now. I have lost my train of thought. A horrific environment usually has some kind of evil, foreboding monster or creature or thing that we don't know what it is until it attacks, and when it does, usually we're not sure about what it was. We just are aware of the repercussions of its attack, the horrific repercussions of its attack. So we need some kind of thing. It doesn't have to be a human. It could be a creature from another plane. It could be the possessed body of a grandmother who has now been brought to life by this evil spirit from hell. It could be the tentacle of Cthulhu. Whatever the case might be, we need to have some kind of motivating factor. It could be the actual environment they're in. The house has been awoken and now will consume them, if we go with some classic horrors from the 60s. We also expect dark spaces. Very few horrors will actually take place in a brightly lit, visually open space. There are a few, and a lot of zombie movies, which ostensibly are horrific rather than thriller or, say, scary, will take place during the day. But not necessarily focusing on the scare of the zombie attack. It's more on the horror of this black bile oozing out of the freshly ripped open mouth with bits of bone sticking out and blood everywhere, and the terror of being infected by having blood sprayed across one's face and accidentally land on one's tongue. It is the horrific element that these kind of things focus on. We also expect lots of death, and we expect death from in and amongst the player group. Now, this is quite tricky for us as a game master, because you don't want to kill off your players, because what are they going to do once you've finished playing with them in game? So they're going to sit and watch their fellows carrying on role-playing. It doesn't necessarily make for a great environment, but we expect PCs to die. Whenever I run a Cthulhu module at an Icon, that's the name of our event, which is coming up, I'm very excited about it, but whenever I run a module at a con and it's a Cthulhu module, players always sit down going, oh, I wonder who's going to go insane and die first. It almost becomes a point of honor to be the character who went mad and ate themselves, or whatever the case might be. So players expect player death. One does not run a horror campaign over years and years and years without some very careful planning. But player death is expected. We are also in expectation of a gigantic climatic showdown with this mysterious big bad creature. Now, this is just narrative imperative. If something is trying to eat you, consume you, steal your soul, use you to impregnate it with its own little slug worm things that are going to later burst out of your eardrums, your nasal cavity, and other orifices, we expect a showdown. So if you are running a horror campaign or a horror setting, you need to anticipate and plan for that showdown. If all of the players die before the showdown happens, it will feel very unsatisfying. The players need to get to a point where at least one of them has survived long enough to have a showdown with the creature, the thing, the whatever. And if they die in that, that's fine, it's accepted, especially if the creature is a god from another dimension. On the other hand, there is also a certain sense of satisfaction of having a player against all odds, having discovered the clues that you've so carefully laid around your setting to defeat said big bad slimy monster thing. So those are some of the expectations. We also expect someone like, say, a big-breasted blonde woman to be reduced to wearing her underclothes and nothing else. But that's more of a movie trope than a role-playing trope. But if you can get one of your players to have their characters naked running through the scene, it helps to build the horror, especially when they realize that the keys to the front door have been left behind in those pants that they were wearing, and they now have to go back to retrieve them. So if you notice, scare isn't part of something that we're expecting from horror. We might like to instill fear, we might like to scare our players, but that's very difficult to do in a role-playing environment, and I've touched on this before. Scaring players whilst you're all sitting in a comfortable environment around a table with plenty of snacks and a heater going or a fire going in the hearth or a swimming pool outside or whatever the conveniences of modern day life bring, it's difficult to scare people. Horror doesn't rely on scare tactics to be successful. It relies on horror. And there are a whole bunch of things that we can look at to make things horrific. And tone, the previous video that I did, last week's episode as a matter of fact, we looked at how to create the tone of horror, to mush up food with red food coloring or to give them stained drinks or whatever the case might be. Those are little tricks that we can do to help enhance the tone of horror. But horror really comes down from how you create the tone of it. And to create the tone of horror, you're going to use 5 keywords. And they're very, very simple because most of us, especially if you're watching this video and listening to it and are aware of what you're sitting on, most of us have them all. I am, of course, talking about your 5 senses. And this is something that you as the game master can practice. And you should be using it anyway in terms of telling good stories because it comes in really, really handy. Using your 5 senses creates a powerful arsenal in your GMing toolkit to create amazing tone, and horror needs it the most. So, what are the 5 senses? Well, you should know this from kindergarten, but they are, in no particular order, sight, smell, taste, hearing, and touch. You should use all of those to describe scenes when you are running a horror campaign. You see large sacks of pink flesh hanging from the ceiling. Great big purple veins insinuate themselves around these sacks, and something is moving below the surface. Clear slime is dripping off of them and puddling in the floor where you can see that it has started to turn a milky, yellowy, pus-like color. Describe what they see. Then describe what they smell. The odor coming off of these meat sacks is of rancid meat that's been left out in the sun for too long. And the slime smells like potatoes that have gone rotten many, many weeks ago. You can also smell mixed in amongst it a coppery blood-like aroma and that ever sweet tasting smell of pus. There's another example. Sweet tasting is a mixture, as a matter of fact, of the two, because taste and smell, of course, are very, very similar. You can taste on the air a sense of ozone. Something electrically charged has been through here, and your tongue tingles as this mixture of smells washes down your nasal passages, and you can literally taste in the air the scent of death, or whatever the case might be. Taste could also come in from you take a sip of water, only to discover that it tastes like semen and has that funny flavor to it. I don't know, it's horrific, right? Touch. As you step onto the vein-like surface of the floor, a bubble forms underneath your foot, and you can feel the fluids within it shifting to one side until it bursts open, releasing a brown fluid that sets your boot aflame or wets your boot. You can smell this aroma of rotting flesh waft up from it, whatever the case might be. So touch doesn't necessarily have to be with your hands. It can be with your feet. You can feel the moisture dripping off of these sacs. Use it to the best of your abilities. Finally, of course, then, what haven't I done? You can hear sounds. So throughout my videos, you can hear the sounds of two little demons pretending to mud wrestle as they bark at one another or run out the door. You can hear the sounds of blood dripping from. You can hear the sound of the scalpel slicing through that flesh. Try and be as descriptive as you can about those five senses and look at each of your players. Some people will react quite a lot to one of those senses. Some people are more visual, some people are more audible, some people are more about the scent, the taste. Try and find, have you ever smelt a cucumber that's been left to turn into liquid cucumber? It is the worst smell on planet Earth. So try to find terms, try to prepare. And there's nothing wrong, by the way, with just before your session starts, jotting down a few descriptive phrases, not whole paragraphs, just a key sentence or something along those lines, to find out how you can best describe things. And then you take that and you twist it slightly. So as you step onto the body of this thing that is littered on the floor, your foot punches through the outer crust of its shell into this warm liquid-like substance which oozes into your boot and touches you in an uncomfortable way. Just play with your descriptions. Play with what is hard and what is soft, what is firm, what's warm, what's cold, what's clammy, what's moist. Look for words, build your vocabulary to describe those five senses to help build the tone. Obviously, the other part about tone in a horror session is you need to make sure that you keep the players in the dark, not necessarily literally. You need to describe things to them that don't make sense. You see footprints forming in the dust in front of you, but when you reach out, you don't feel anybody. You hear the sound of a clinking chain somewhere in the distance. Another great use of those five senses is to help build anticipation. Players will often go, I walk down the corridor. And you might describe that you walk down this dark, dank corridor, but they don't care. They're after the monster. So instead of just giving them the monster, rather have them hear something. You hear a scraping noise just next to your left ear. You turn, but you see nothing. The corridor is empty. Let them walk down the corridor and the next corridor. And then you say, you hear that scraping sound. Only this time it's coming from directly in front of your face. If they can't see it, they can't just attack it. And you can use that sound all the time. A great example was I was running a game over the weekend and I had the players walk into a kitchen and I said, you see in the sink brown dishwater that's absolutely still. And then you see something move underneath it. None of them were ready to stick their hand into that brackish water. We all know that there is something in there and that the first person who sticks their hand in will feel nothing at first and as they're about to pull their hand out, something will grab them and pull them into that sink. So they purposefully ignored it, which was absolutely fine. They went off and did something else, and then when they were hiding in the kitchen from the big bad, I said, you hear a dripping sound coming from the scullery, and then you hear very softly the water starting to drip ever so closer. They knew something was coming out of that water. They created their own horror by imagining what had now come out of this brown sludge and was coming towards them. It turned into a tentacle thing, which they eventually killed without too much difficulty, and then they went back to the sink, which was still filled with brackish water. One of them decided the best way to access the sink was simply to crack it open, let the water flow out, and then claim what was ever at the bottom, because they assumed there was some kind of prize. They cracked it open, and what happened? Worms, little thin needle-like worms, spilt out onto the ground and started inching towards them. So they set them on fire, and they crackled and hissed and popped as they died in the flames, their little mouths opening and closing, their tongues darting out, trying one last attack before they succumb to the flames. So you can build and build and build, and then of course they found the prize, which is a ring or whatever it was. But the point is that once you've set something up, remember to bring it back time and time again, and to use the clues that you have at your disposal to help build that anticipation in the mind of the player. Once you've kind of set your tone, and generally speaking, tone will work for horror whether it's in space, whether it's in Victorian England, whether it is in a cowboy western type horror setting, or whether it is in modern day. Whether it is in a high elf's castle and he's gone dementedly mad and is trying to torment the knight and his wizard, whatever the case might be, horror is pretty much horror. It's a universal kind of experience all around that tone. So from that we can then look for plots, and there are very few plots when it comes to horror. Typically there are 3. I'm sure you can think of more, but the 3 primary ones are escape, as in escape from wherever it is, and you have to survive long enough to get to your destination. Hunt, you have to hunt whatever it is. It's gone into a lair, and now you become the hunted. Trapped, you are trapped in a space and must now move away from that space. And the space is trying to kill you. And I've got examples for you so you can see a bit of a clarity on that one. There's an interesting twist to horror though, and that is the last part of this particular discussion tonight, is that horror has to change. It has to shift from being the players, are the people that are being horrified by these bizarre acts, by these horrendous things. It has to shift from that to them pursuing. They have to go from, this is horrific, we're seeing babies eating each other in their cribs, chewing their way out of wombs, whatever the case might be, we need to see a shift. They need to understand what's causing the horror, and then they need to actively start going after it. So it changes from horror to horrific, gross, gruesome, macabre, but the players are now on a mission. We know what is hunting us, we know what is trying to kill us, we must now try and destroy it. And you need to have that shift happen, because you can only sustain horror for so long before all of those wonderful descriptions that you're throwing out become a little bit jaded. And you always need to ratchet up the horror as well. And one of the easiest tricks that I've found to do that is to have your creatures seem invincible and all-powerful. Have that ghost come out of the wall, deal massive damage to one of the players, and before anyone can react, have it disappear back into the wall. Have that little child hand out a lollipop towards one of the players, and as the player tries to take it from them, the child just rips their heart out of their chests, grabs the heart, and runs down the corridor and disappears. So let the players go, how do we defeat something so powerful that can just appear and disappear? And then over time, you let them discover those clues so that eventually they go, we are hunting this child, we are hunting this monster, we now are in command. So that's the shift that you have to make sure happens. So some of the references that I was thinking of when looking at this topic was a very good example, is American Horror Story. I think I got that right. It's out there. The American Horror Story Season 1. The first 6 episodes, spoilers, the first 6 episodes are horror. And they are horrific thriller horror. You really do not know what's going to happen. There is an absolute tangible fear that comes through. The second half shifts, and you now see the perspective of those things that were causing the horror. And so now it changes from being a thriller. Is the ghost going to kill the family? Is it not going to kill the family? Is it a ghost? Is it the neighbor? All of those kind of questions have now been answered halfway through, and now it changes to how are they going to defeat it? How are they going to survive? Are they going to become one with it? So that's a very good example of a horror. Another good example is the film Alien, the very first one that came out in the 1970s by Ridley Scott. By modern day standards, it's not a horror in the slightest. We don't feel fear, we don't feel terror, we don't feel repulsed by the creature or by the scenes of the thing bursting out of the man's chest. In the 70s, that was absolutely horrific. And if you go even further back in cinematic history, there was The Mummy, which was released and had women throwing up and fainting in the cinemas in the 1960s, with Christopher Lee wearing basically wet toilet paper on his face. We've advanced since then. However, Alien is a good example of how we go from the unknown horror to the known horror and the chase and the eventual victory, which later on we discover isn't necessarily a victory. House of Wax is a good example of people escaping from a horrific situation, and there's lots of gore in that film. There's lots of moments that are cringeworthy, that are horrific, and it's a relatively good film as well. Saw 1, 2, 3, 4, 22, 25, however many they've eventually made. Saw is a psychological horror because they are forcing the characters to do things that we as humans would never do. Stick your hand into a bunch of needles. It's horrific in its content, not necessarily in the scare factor. It's there, of course, but the horror is real. The Ring and The Grudge. Now, in my very early career in television, I actually edited the trailers for those two films from the original Japanese execution into a South African version for our audiences here. And watching the Japanese version and watching the subsequent remake, I have to say the Japanese version was more horrific. Even though I was reading subtitles, which should distance me from the film, it actually brought me further in because I was becoming part of it. And there, it's all about the unknown. You don't know what's going on. You don't know if the characters can even survive these things because you are aware of what's happening and they are not. So The Ring and The Grudge are great examples of horror. There's lots of scare in there as well, but it is the imagery, the way that things are portrayed, the girl climbing out of the TV, all those kind of things. It's just the horrific portrayal of everyday activities, which makes them, in my opinion, good horrors. So I hope this will help you re-look at the horror scenario and perhaps to create a situation where your players are going, oh, I stick my hand, no, I'm not going to, it's not worth it. I'm not going to stick my hand in that thing. No. That's the kind of reaction you want when you're running a horror. You don't want your players screaming at you in terror and running out of the room. Well, maybe you do, but I wouldn't recommend it. Remember, we're here to escape, not to have nightmares moving forward. Point of the matter is, you want your players to have that reaction, that little convulsion that I threw up a little bit in my mouth type of thing. If you can achieve that, you've achieved horror. Keep them in the dark until absolutely the last moment, and then let them have it from all different angles. So I hope this has been useful to you. If it has, hit that like button. If you want to see more, hit that subscribe button. And of course, my marketing goblin's going to kill me. And of course, check out our website, www.greatgamemaster.com. There's a whole bunch of reviews there. We look at different role-playing systems. The game that I run, the role-playing game that I run, Bacon Battalion, is up there as well. And there's just a whole bunch of other stuff that's pretty cool, character generators and whatnot. Until next time, happy gaming.